I have learned over the course of my career that the most dangerous moments in international affairs rarely announce themselves with clarity. They arrive wrapped in headlines that simplify, moralize, and distract. What matters is not how events are branded for public consumption, but what actually occurred, where, under whose authority, and with what strategic intent. The recent seizure of oil tankers linked to Russia, paired with the introduction of a new U.S. sanctions bill, belongs squarely in that category. The incident itself is more revealing than the narrative constructed around it. At sea, tankers were intercepted under claims of sanctions enforcement, regulatory compliance, or indirect association with restricted entities. On paper, these actions are presented as lawful measures taken to uphold international norms. In reality, they represent the physical application of economic warfare. A ship stopped, delayed, or seized is not an abstraction. It is steel, fuel, crews, insurance liabilities, and state authority colliding in international waters or contested jurisdictions. These actions do not occur in a vacuum, and they are never perceived as neutral by the targeted state. Simultaneously, in Washington, legislators advanced a new sanctions bill aimed at tightening economic pressure on Russia. Sanctions are described as nonviolent alternatives to war, but that framing ignores their cumulative effect. When sanctions are enforced through physical interdiction, they cross from paper policy into coercive action. The distinction between economic pressure and strategic escalation begins to erode. I have seen this before. When tools designed to signal resolve begin to inflict material damage, they stop being signals and start becoming provocations. The headline tells the public that the United States is enforcing rules and holding adversaries accountable. The incident tells a different story. It shows a pattern of escalation occurring incrementally, without a declared end state, and without serious public discussion of risk. Russia does not experience tanker seizures and new sanctions as administrative measures. It experiences them as hostile acts carried out under legal camouflage. The danger lies not in any single seizure or bill, but in the normalization of these acts as routine. When pressure replaces strategy and enforcement replaces diplomacy, nations drift closer to confrontation without ever admitting they have chosen that path. When I first encountered sanctions as an instrument of state power, they were framed as leverage, a way to compel compliance without resorting to force. That was the theory. In practice, sanctions have mutated into something far more rigid and destructive. They are no longer tied to achievable political outcomes. They persist long after their stated objectives have failed, sustained not by strategic logic, but by institutional inertia and domestic politics. At that point, sanctions stop being policy. They become a weapon. What distinguishes a weapon from a policy is intent and effect. A policy seeks to change behavior. A weapon seeks to impose cost. Modern sanctions regimes are built almost entirely around punishment. They aim to degrade economies, disrupt logistics, and create internal stress, all while maintaining the illusion of moral restraint. The language used to justify them is legalistic and sanitized, but the consequences are concrete and often indiscriminate. Energy markets destabilize. Supply chains fracture. Civilian populations absorb the shock while political leadership adapts and hardens. Against Russia, sanctions have been applied with remarkable confidence and little reflection. Each new package is announced as decisive, yet none have altered Moscow's core strategic calculations. Instead, they have accelerated Russia's economic adaptation, expanded alternative trade networks, and reinforced a siege mentality within its security establishment. When sanctions fail to coerce, the response in Washington is not reassessment, but escalation. More restrictions, broader enforcement, physical interdiction at sea. This is where sanctions cross a critical threshold. When enforcement requires ships to be seized, cargoes delayed, and insurers coerced under threat of secondary penalties, the sanctions regime assumes the characteristics of maritime conflict. The United States insists this is still economic pressure. Russia sees something else entirely, an attempt to assert control over global commerce in ways that directly harm its national interests. From a military perspective, that perception matters more than any legal argument. Sanctions deployed as weapons create feedback loops. Each escalation justifies the next, while the original political objective fades into irrelevance. The result is not compliance, but confrontation managed through a bureaucratic process rather than strategic design. I have watched this pattern repeat itself across decades. It never ends cleanly. It ends when reality intervenes, usually at a cost far higher than anyone intended to pay. For most people, the ocean is invisible until something goes wrong. For strategists and military planners, it is never out of mind. The maritime domain is where global power is exercised quietly, persistently, and with deniability. It is also where economic warfare becomes physical long before a single shot is fired. When tankers are seized or delayed under sanctions enforcement, the sea itself becomes a battlefield, even if no one is willing to call it that. Energy tankers are not just commercial vessels. They are strategic assets moving through a web of choke points, legal jurisdictions, insurance regimes, and naval power. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bosphorus, the Danish Straits, the Suez Canal, these are not lines on a map. They are pressure points. Control or disruption of traffic through them has immediate consequences for global markets and national security. When the United States or its partners interfere with tanker movements linked to Russia, they are signaling a willingness to contest those pressure points indirectly. What makes this form of escalation dangerous is its ambiguity. No war is declared, no blockade is announced. Instead, enforcement actions are justified through regulatory language, port state control, or sanctions compliance. But from the perspective of the targeted state, the effect is indistinguishable from hostile interdiction. Ships delayed mean contracts broken. Cargoes seized mean revenue denied. Crews detained mean state authority challenged. These are not symbolic acts. They are operational ones. Russia understands maritime vulnerability. Its economy depends heavily on energy exports, much of which must transit waters controlled or influenced by NATO-aligned states. Moscow also understands history. Naval pressure has long been used to strangle adversaries economically, often as a prelude to broader conflict. When tanker seizures increase, Russia does not see law enforcement. It sees rehearsal. The United States, meanwhile, appears to treat the maritime domain as a risk-free arena for pressure. That assumption is flawed. Escalation at sea has a way of generating unintended encounters. Shadowing becomes harassment. Inspection becomes detention. Detention invites response. Once navies begin operating with conflicting assumptions about legitimacy, miscalculation becomes inevitable. The maritime battlefield rewards patience, clarity, and restraint. What I see instead is improvisation disguised as policy. When economic coercion moves onto the water, it carries with it the full weight of strategic consequence. Oceans absorb many things. Misjudgment is not one of them. One of the first lessons I learned in intelligence work is that intent is less important than perception. You can explain your actions endlessly, but an adversary will interpret them through the lens of its own history, vulnerabilities, and fears. When the United States seizes tankers linked to Russia and tightens sanctions enforcement at sea, Moscow does not parse congressional language or press briefings. It reads these actions as signals of hostile design. Russia's strategic culture is shaped by encirclement and endurance. From Napoleon to Hitler to the Cold War, Russian planners have internalized the belief that Western power advances incrementally, testing limits before committing fully. Economic pressure, in that worldview, is not an alternative to war, but a preparatory phase. Sanctions, interdictions, and legal pressure are understood as shaping operations, designed to weaken the state before a more direct confrontation. Whether that is Washington's intent is almost irrelevant. What matters is how the pattern appears from Moscow. Tanker seizures strike at a specific Russian anxiety, vulnerability of access. Energy exports are not just revenue, they are leverage, stability, and strategic breathing room. When those flows are disrupted by external actors, it reinforces the belief that Russia is under coordinated assault. This perception feeds directly into military planning. Naval deployments increase. Escort doctrines are reconsidered. Rules of engagement harden. What begins as economic enforcement quietly reshapes the operational environment. There is also a psychological dimension that Western policymakers consistently underestimate. Russia measures resolve differently. Compromise under pressure is read as weakness, not pragmatism. Sanctions that are escalated despite clear evidence of limited effectiveness are interpreted as proof that the West is ideologically committed to Russia's strategic defeat, not behavioral change. That conclusion narrows Moscow's options. When an adversary believes the end state is regime collapse or permanent containment, restraint loses its appeal. From my perspective, this is where danger crystallizes. Perception drives posture, and posture drives action. Russia's response to maritime pressure will not be rhetorical forever. It will be operational, asymmetric, and legally framed in the same way Western actions are now framed. Once both sides operate under the assumption that escalation is already underway, the space for correction shrinks rapidly. This is not about justifying Russia's view. It is about acknowledging reality. A strategy that ignores how it is received is not a strategy at all. It is self-deception, and it is how crises mature into conflicts no one publicly admits they were preparing for. One of the most comforting myths in modern statecraft is the belief that legality can contain escalation. I have watched governments convince themselves that as long as actions are wrapped in legal language, they remain controlled, proportional, and safe. This belief is deeply ingrained in Western policy circles, and it is profoundly dangerous. Law does not neutralize power, it rationalizes its use. The seizure of tankers and the enforcement of sanctions at sea are justified through a dense web of domestic statutes, executive authorities, and selective interpretations of international law. On paper, everything appears orderly. Flags are cited, jurisdictions are invoked, compliance regimes are referenced. This creates the illusion that events are governed by rules rather than will. But law, especially in the international arena, has never been a substitute for consent or balance. It functions only as long as all parties accept its legitimacy. From the perspective of the enforcing state, legality becomes a shield against accountability. Actions are no longer strategic choices. They are obligations. Officials claim their hands are tied by statutes and regulations as if laws emerge spontaneously rather than being written to enable specific outcomes. This is how escalation hides in plain sight. Decisions that would otherwise require serious strategic debate are reduced to administrative procedure. From the perspective of the targeted state, the legal argument is irrelevant. Russia does not experience tanker seizures as neutral enforcement of norms. It experiences them as a selective application of power by actors who control key institutions and maritime infrastructure. International law, in this context, appears less like a shared framework and more like an instrument wielded by those with enforcement capacity. That perception corrodes whatever stabilizing effect law is supposed to provide. History offers no comfort here. Naval interdictions justified by legal authority have repeatedly led to broader conflicts when the targeted state rejected the legitimacy of the claim. The lesson is consistent. When law is used to mask coercion, it loses its restraining function. It becomes a trigger rather than a brake. The illusion of control is seductive. It allows policymakers to believe they are managing escalation when in reality, they are outsourcing strategy to legal frameworks that cannot account for fear, pride, or retaliation. Law can describe actions, but it cannot govern consequences. Those are dictated by power, perception, and response. Ignoring that truth does not preserve order. It accelerates its collapse. Escalation becomes most dangerous when it is no longer the result of deliberate choice, but of momentum. I recognize this pattern because I have seen it before in conflicts where policy instruments accumulate without ever being reconciled into a coherent strategy. Each step is justified as necessary. None are evaluated against a realistic end state. This is where the current trajectory of sanctions, enforcement, and maritime pressure against Russia now sits. There is no clearly articulated objective, tying tankers, seizures, expanded sanctions, and legal coercion together. Is the goal to change Russian behavior in Ukraine, to weaken Russia's long-term economic capacity, or to signal resolve to domestic and allied audiences? These are fundamentally different aims, yet they are treated as interchangeable. When tools are deployed without clarity of purpose, success becomes impossible to define and failure becomes invisible. What replaces strategy in this environment is process. Sanctions expand because previous sanctions exist. Enforcement intensifies because enforcement mechanisms are available. Bureaucracies reward action, not reflection. Political leaders inherit frameworks they are reluctant to challenge, especially when doing so risks accusations of weakness. The result is escalation by default. No one stands up and declares a new phase of confrontation, but everyone behaves as if one has begun. From a military perspective, this is deeply unsettling. Actions taken in the economic and legal domains shape the operational environment just as surely as troop movements. Russia responds not to stated intentions, but to accumulated effects. Naval patrols increase, red lines shift quietly, thresholds for response are lower. Each side convinces itself it is reacting defensively, even as the overall level of confrontation rises. The absence of a strategy also removes off-ramps. When pressure is the policy, there is no mechanism for de-escalation short of capitulation by one side. That is not a plan, it is a gamble. History is unforgiving to those who confuse pressure with control. Adversaries adapt, alliances strain, and credibility erodes when threats cannot be reconciled with outcomes. Escalation without strategy does not announce itself as recklessness. It presents as competence, resolve, and adherence to rules. But beneath that surface is a void where strategic judgment should be. That void is where miscalculation thrives and where conflicts acquire lives of their own. There comes a moment in every failed strategy when pressure becomes a substitute for thought. I have watched this happen repeatedly across decades and continents. Leaders mistake endurance for success. They confuse the ability to impose cost with the ability to shape outcomes. In that moment, reality stops informing policy, and policy begins to argue with reality instead. That is where the current confrontation with Russia now resides. Pressure feels productive. It generates activity, headlines, and a sense of motion. Sanctions are announced. Assets are seized. Legal authorities are expanded. Each action reassures policymakers that they are doing something. What it does not do is answer the fundamental question every strategist must confront: how does this end? When pressure is applied without a credible path to resolution, it does not bend reality. It collides with it. Russia has absorbed sanctions, adapted its economy, rerouted trade, and recalibrated its military posture. None of this suggests approval or acquiescence. It suggests preparation. History shows that states under sustained external pressure do not collapse neatly. They harden, centralize, and redefine their thresholds for response. When that happens, the cost of miscalculation rises sharply while the space for compromise narrows. The West, meanwhile, continues to operate under assumptions that no longer hold, that economic dominance guarantees compliance, that legal authority ensures legitimacy, that escalation can be managed indefinitely without consequence. These beliefs persist not because they are true, but because abandoning them would require admitting that leverage has limits and that power, once misused, diminishes. What is most striking to me is how little attention is paid to the human and systemic cost of this approach. Energy insecurity spreads. Global markets fragment. Neutral states are coerced into alignment. The international system becomes less stable, not more. Pressure meant to preserve order ends up accelerating disorder. Reality does not yield to insistence. It asserts itself. When nations ignore that lesson, they do not lose because they lack power. They lost because they refuse to see the world as it is, not as they wished it to be. Strategy begins with honesty. When that decays, pressure fills the void. And pressure, unmoored from reality, has never produced anything but ruin.